Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. Over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book, while on here, I shed some light on the big issues. Today's episode is about what is in store for China with a new Democratic American president in the White House. The American relationship to China changed during the Trump administration. Will things ever go back to the way they were before? Were Trump's actions mostly unique to him, or did some of them reflect deep changes occurring within the United States? Who exactly is duping whom? And how will China try to deal with a new American administration in a very changed world? Let's see whether red or blue really matters when great powers collide. Let's start with the obvious. Trump was not normal. People on the right like to say that Trump was an epochal change, that he was the first 21st century American president to really go after China. People on the left say Trump was totally played and that he may have been loud and in China's face, but none of his actions actually amounted to much of anything in the end. These are very different opinions, but there is one thing that both sides agree on. Trump definitely did not engage in business as usual with China. There are a lot of emotions on both sides, but it is ridiculous to pretend nothing changed under Trump. Trump not only changed the conversation on China, he catalyzed a major transformation of the relationship between the United States and China. On a deeper level, Trump also transformed what was possible in modern U.S. foreign policy versus another major power. Whether it seems strong or thuggish, it was nonetheless a tangible shift. Obama may have talked about a pivot to Asia, but Trump was confrontational towards China like no other recent American president, and he did things that the United States had not done in decades. Under Trump, the phrase great power competition started appearing everywhere, and the U.S. started acting like it was back in a real rodeo with a real competitor. One major arena was trade, where Trump dusted off antique laws to retaliate against not just Chinese economic behavior, but really the whole structure of the Chinese economic system. Trade matters. Don't buy China's hype. Exports remain one of China's most important and productive industries. It brings in hard currency, and many of China's most impressive firms, from Huawei to the drone maker DJI, are totally reliant on it. Trump targeted trade so hard that China began officially talking about a major plan to reorient its economy around domestic consumption. This is China's so-called dual circulation strategy, an unlikely attempt to wean itself off of foreign markets. An economy built on organic domestic consumption has always been China's fantasy, but Trump made it an existential issue. Trump's attacks weren't elegant, and bilateral trade deficits don't really mean what they meant in the 1980s, but the consequences were nonetheless huge. Trade wars broadened into attacks on Chinese technology and on an overall effort to limit China's technological growth. Trump blacklisted swaths of Chinese companies in fields as varied as AI and biotechnology. He limited the use of critical U.S. software in advanced Chinese industries like semiconductors. He massively curbed investment into the U.S. from China, strengthened reviews of Chinese investments in acquisitions, and pushed to decouple the financial and technological systems of the two countries. Add in a forceful posture in the South China Sea, a declaration of genocide in Xinjiang, a coordinated ban on Chinese 5G technology, and major sales of weapons to Taiwan, and it is very clear what is going on. This was a big deal and a major shift. But here's the really interesting thing. Biden is going to keep a lot of this. He is not going to step back nearly as much as people may have thought during the campaign. Life is not going back to the way it was. Tariffs are staying. Arms sales with Taiwan are going through. All the actions Trump took are now leverage for Biden. There is no reason to abandon any of it without getting something in return. On China, the difference between Biden and Trump will be more one of style and emphasis than one of substance, because Trump was responding to the shifting desire of the U.S. electorate. And judging by the current emotions of the U.S. population, Trump's 4 years might be just the prelude. The key thing to understand is that this major shift on China was not primarily caused by Trump. At root, it did not happen in the U.S. government. It happened inside the U.S. electorate, and it reflects a major sea change in U.S. public opinion. According to Pew Research, the share of Americans expressing a negative view of China went from 35% in 2011 to 73% in 2020. The pandemic is pushing the number towards 80% or more. The American population is angry at China, and this is a rare and valuable bipartisan emotion. People on the political left and right may disagree on the tactics, but almost everyone felt something, anything, had to be done against China. Trump was the first politician to properly read the crowd and tap into this anger. Trump was also the catalyst to push this issue even farther. He got to the China issue first, and then he pushed the government to go much farther and much faster on China than would ever have happened otherwise. He showed the American people, both political parties and the US government, just how far the US could go without any major repercussions. Let's take a step back now to understand how we got here. How we got to a place where an insurgent political figure could capitalize on latent public opinions and preferences to try and reshape everything we thought we knew about how the US engages with the rest of the world. In 2007, Ben Bernanke said, quote, "When the offsetting effects of globalization on the prices of manufactured imports and on energy and commodity prices are considered together, there seems to be little reason for concluding that globalization overall has significantly reduced inflation in the United States in recent years. Indeed, the opposite may be true." End quote. Now, this is a bit dense, but it is really worth unpacking. What the old Fed chairman was saying way back in 2007 was that globalization was no longer lowering prices. The key economic benefit of globalization touted for the average American was lower consumer and producer prices, which was ultimately supposed to translate into better household finances. But somewhere between 2003 and 2007, it was already cutting in the other direction. Globalization was no longer improving US household finances, it was harming them. And this makes very intuitive sense. We live in a world of scarce, limited resources, and hundreds of millions of Indians, Chinese, and other developing populations were joining the world economy and looking to access these same resources. Academics had been going back and forth over this one question for decades. Would globalization cause prices to rise because more people needed the resources, or would new supplies and efficiencies keep inflation low? In 1980, a biologist named Paul Ehrlich and a business professor named Julian Simon made a bet about whether resource scarcity would cause prices to rise over the next decade or to fall. When the now famous Simon-Ehrlich bet ended in 1990, Simon won. Prices for a set of non-government controlled commodities did not rise. Resource scarcity was apparently overhyped, or at least that is what this story is supposed to say. But that is not the full story. If we replay the same bet for every subsequent decade, so from 1990 to 2000, from 2000 to 2010, and 2010 to 2020, Ehrlich would have won every decade easily. Scarcity had returned, prices were rising, and this impacted the American economy. This resource scarcity, plus global wage competition and inflation across a number of key US sectors such as healthcare and education, all of this hit the US workforce hard. It is no surprise a number of key US economic indicators, such as median wages, have been flat or stagnant since the 1970s. When low wages met higher prices and global competition, millions of jobs were lost. More importantly, the ability to make a reasonable middle-class life also started to disappear. What a one-income household could easily afford in the late 1960s was now mostly out of reach for the average two-income household of the 2010s. The economics profession as a whole misanalyzed and then misdiagnosed this problem until it was far too late. Even today, they really only fess up in tepid, lukewarm, half-apologetic ways. A whole academic infrastructure developed to support policies that lowered prices for a while, but as Bernanke, who was head of the Fed during the last financial crisis, just said, it soon pushed prices higher and contributed to hollowing out the US labor force. To say this was a bad look would be an understatement. It created a lot of justifiable resentment. It is one thing to tell Americans up front that they would be trading some prosperity at home for peace around the world. It is another thing entirely to pretend that they could have it all, that the world could be at peace and everyone at home could be wealthy and happy. Trump exposed and then harnessed the enormous latent anger at all of this. Now both US political parties are wise to the game. Few politicians will go into the details of what brought the United States to this point, but every ambitious politician now acts like this is the new normal. For example, on February 2nd, Biden actually decided to reinstate tariffs on the United Arab Emirates after Trump reduced them on his way out as part of a bag of goodies sent to the UAE in exchange for its peace deal with Israel. Here's how Biden explained the move. Quote, "In my view, the available evidence indicates that imports from the United Arab Emirates may still displace domestic production and therefore threaten to impair our national security." End quote. If this is the new standard for tariffs, then globalization is over. One of the main points of globalization was to displace national production and spread it to wherever it was cheapest around the globe. Now all a country has to do is possibly threaten national production for its production role to get hit with tariffs. Add in the fact that Biden expanded the U.S. Buy American policy, and this is a good indication of where things are headed. The major enabler of globalization, the United States, is hitting the brakes, and no one should be more concerned than globalization's great beneficiary, China. If it feels like the US has gone from 0 to 60 on this issue in almost no time, it's because it has. For years, the US political class was detached from the consequences of globalization. Then, the deep changes it wrought in the socioeconomic and cultural fabric of the US led to a political eruption. That was what finally sent both US political parties scrambling for a massive new block of angry, disenfranchised voters. Nothing makes politicians move quite as fast as their own job security. And nobody should be surprised if this gets ugly. Let's be crystal clear. The current people elected to US political office and who run the federal agencies are not really up to the job. These are not the people who first built NASA, the US highway system, or organized the US military effort in World War II. These are not the people who fought the Cold War. They did not arrange a globally coordinated campaign to encircle and defeat a totalitarian state the size of all of North America. The US has been coasting on an aimless federal policy that's largely been running on autopilot for the last 30 years, except when it is periodically convulsed by new social issues or apparent foreign threats. There is very little actual vision or direction for where the country is going, and there hasn't been for a long time, and this is reflected in the quality of American leadership. It is slow, clumsy, and often useless. Unlike the present Chinese government, the current US federal government has not been involved in a momentous project to rejuvenate its society. By and large, US elected officials have been a rotating group of lawyers trying to solve the problems that land on their laps from constituents, or more commonly, from a large global investor class that has used the post-Cold War globalization scheme as cover to supercharge corporate profits. And this isn't even supposed to be an indictment of those corporations or investors. This is where the incentives naturally lead them. And quasi-institutional figures in America, like Kenneth Galbraith, had been arguing for decades that corporations have inherent tendencies to move in this sort of direction. But back during the Cold War, the idea that any corporation or set of corporations could run US policy had felt like an absurd idea to a lot of people. Back then, the US was focused on much larger, higher-order priorities, like averting a global nuclear war, and this tempered and directed a lot of corporate activity. But when these priorities left with the fall of the Soviet Union, it created a vacuum, and corporations swooped in to fill the void. Without any overarching vision, American politicians went from having a real motivating purpose to just serving corporate interests. And to make things even worse, this is all wrapped up in a bit of a moral dilemma that people usually don't acknowledge. The late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s wasn't a black and white time period when a business elite was raking in the profits at the expense of everyone else. It was also a period when hundreds and hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty all around the world. Politicians, lobbyists, and executives could justify small gains or even backsliding in many parts of the US because of the great benefits experienced by people in the developing world. But rather than tell the US electorate that there was a moral dilemma here, that the United States could not do everything possible to help lift up the populations of other countries without also harming its own middle class, people were instead told that everyone was going to win. Farmers in the Midwest would win. Chinese peasants would win. Silicon Valley companies would win. It was all a win, win, win. A win for everyone. Until, of course, it wasn't. Some people were 1,000 times better off than before. Some people were barely 0.5% better than before. And some lost everything. Trump's political rhetoric sounded ridiculous to many people, but it was only a nationalist variant of what the implied narrative had been for years. It was only when people were actually told out loud that they would win so much and get tired of winning that it all started to sound like a farce. One of the key reasons there is so much political distrust in the United States today is because the core architecture of the last 30 years, basically the terms of the agreement made for the post-Cold War world, these terms were never really laid out. Nothing was told up front. Instead, American politics just frothed and churned endlessly, while decentralized incentives and past decisions took care of the rest. And when the biggest beneficiary of globalization by far is China, that sets the scene for some major animus against another country, which is proving to be a major and convenient save for the feckless US political class and both political parties. China seemed to develop into a major threat at the perfect time. It came at the right moment to reorient the US towards a new nemesis. From the emotional perspective of the US population, China is the enemy, along with a generic group of abstract elites in the West, but China is the much more real, visible, and threatening enemy. There is also no one better for wealthy elites to shift the blame onto, even though their fortunes are very much tied up with China in the current arrangement of the global economic system. There is more economic tie-in with China than with any other past competitor state. The US and the Soviet Union lived in different economic worlds. The US and China live on the same block. Now, as listeners know, this podcast does not take the threat from China lightly. China will be the only major competitor to the United States until at least 2050. This is basically just a numbers game. After the 20th century, the world map is simply running out of challengers to the United States. If the US plays its cards right, it will almost certainly come out on top in this struggle. And honestly, it doesn't even have to play them all that well. China has major underlying problems within the country that are just as bad as the split between US middle-class fortunes and the developing world. In fact, its problems are much, much worse than that. What China represents to US political parties right now is a convenient enemy to reorient themselves towards. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The US was a far more capable nation when it found itself in competition with the Soviet Union. There are many ways in which competition can make an individual or a nation stronger. But what the US really needs to do is define its vision. It needs an affirmative plan for what it wants to do and be as a nation. This has been absent for the last 30 years. And currently, China is being used as an easy foil to allow both US political parties to again avoid figuring out what the future United States will look like. People should never forget there is a serious opportunity cost to winning a competition against another powerful nation if it also means another 30 or 40 years of wandering in the desert without a sense of where the country is going or what it wants to accomplish. Right now, China is a gift to both US political parties because it can make them seem tough and competent where they are really flailing around uselessly most of the time and are totally mismatched to current challenges. The Chinese Communist Party is very aware of how fickle and adrift both US political parties are. It is very good at throwing them bones, distracting them, and appeasing them in minor ways. And of course, when that doesn't work, the American political parties are very good at distracting themselves as well. But this time, both US political parties are going to try to capitalize on the roiling animosity to China within the US population. Republicans got a head start, but Democrats are very, very unwilling to look weak on China. Trump's actions left the American left in the bizarre position of supporting free trade, while the American right sought to protect American workers and industries with tariffs. This is a bizarre inversion of where things were only a few years before. Nonetheless, both US parties have some other interests China is going to try to use to limit how hard the US can push it. On the left, there is huge concern over climate change. This is basically the last remaining area where China has any sort of pull or leverage. China is more than willing to offer compromise or at least the appearance of cooperation and coordination on the climate in exchange for some breathing space. But Biden and the Democratic leadership will have to try and protect the planet without also looking like they are handing it over to China. And that might be a tough needle to thread. After all, China's climate story is getting harder to believe considering it uses more coal than the rest of the world combined. And that's not getting better. According to Global Energy Monitor, in 2020, China built over 3 times as much new coal power capacity as all other countries in the world combined. So China's climate growth numbers are huge and impressive, but they're just heading in the wrong direction. On the right, there are a number of legacy industries that are still heavily invested in globalization. In fact, it is their key growth strategy for the future. They are still arbitraging production costs and hoping to sell their products to hundreds of millions of consumers abroad, and especially to the Chinese market, which the Communist Party always seems to leave tantalizingly out of grasp. Sometimes firms get limited access, sometimes the government whips up nationalist mobs to shut companies out. But China's influence over these businesses and the Republican Party took a major hit after Trump's populist insurrection scrambled the chessboard and at least temporarily ejected many traditional businesses and business conservatives from the Republican Party. In both parties, China is up against a wall of resistance. Its freedom to maneuver is small, much smaller than it has ever been since relations were normalized in the 1970s. Even in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989, China at least had Western businesses on its side. Now it has nothing and no one. Even if China succeeded in assembling the Injustice League of Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and others, which it won't, this motley crew would still do more harm than good. In fact, relations between the US and China have gotten so bad on so many fronts, from military tensions in the Pacific to cyber espionage to systemic economic issues to technological competition and vast human rights abuses, that the US-China relationship is in the process of fundamentally breaking down. Few of the basic understandings of the last 50 years are going to survive. There are not going to be any new meaningful agreements between the US and China. At this point, relations between the two countries are just a very dangerous form of political theater. All of this was on display in March 2021 during the first talks between the Biden administration and China in Anchorage, Alaska. Both sides were deadlocked from day one because this is the new normal, regardless of who is in power. Within days, new sanctions and recriminations were flying in both directions. So depending on your perspective, on China, Biden is just a more politically correct version of Trump, or perhaps Trump was just a more politically incorrect version of the first Democratic president of the 2020s. Overall, China got very lucky during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. George Bush was already looking at confronting China back in the early 2000s, but this was sidelined after September 11th and then by the resulting wars in the Middle East. The financial crisis at the end of the decade also pushed any sort of reckoning for China even farther out. Obama focused on the domestic economy, on rebuilding America's image abroad, and on trying to wind down America's wars in the Middle East. He wanted to create a spirit of global cooperation after the divisive Bush years, a position with obvious parallels to the current Biden administration. Only in the last decade did China first see a minor pivot to Asia by the US under Obama, and then major explosive retaliation under Trump. Now, at the start of the 2020s, China is facing an American electorate and pair of American political parties that are totally divided on most things, except for China. China is going to have to do everything possible to prevent the US from focusing too much on China. That attention could be disastrous. The shifting American electorate is primarily a crisis for China, but there is also potentially an opportunity. The US political system is undergoing a fundamental rearrangement. The two political parties are composed of shifting coalitions that are slowly going to rework themselves over the coming years. But this process is slow. It is going to take at least 2 more presidential election cycles and probably closer to 10 years for things to really sort themselves out. So there is a window, but during this time, the baseline has already shifted. Globalization is on its way out, and China is facing not so much a changing of the guard in US political leadership as a tectonic shift within the United States itself. The chaotic ripples this shift causes will make China think it has many new opportunities. In fact, it will slowly come to learn that what it thought were the bars of a cage were actually the walls and roof of its house, and that tussling with the United States isn't a way to great power, but a sure way to find itself exposed to the elements.